Hello, how's everyone doing today? I'm here with special guests, Professor Fred Foldvary and Walter Block, to debate land tax. Let me introduce the guests. I'll introduce Fred Foldvary first because he's my professor, still grading me, and a little brown nosing never hurt anyone. Professor Foldvary is a Austrian economist. He teaches at San Jose State. He is a geoanarchist. He is the author of such books as The Soul of Liberty and Public Goods and Private Communities. Walter Block is an Austrian economist. He teaches at Loyola University. He is the author of such books as Defending the Undefendable and The Case for Discrimination. How are you guys doing today?
Fine. Pretty good, thanks.
Good. So I guess we're going to start the debate. Fred will go first. Each side will talk for 15 minutes. So, Fred, you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
All right, let's go starting now.
Yeah, policy theory has to be a matter of comparative analysis. You have to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. For example, if you're looking at pollution policy and you're comparing a pollution charge versus permit trading versus regulations, you can't then say, well, none of the pollution charge is no good because emissions are not a harm in the first place. The premise is that pollution is harmful and the government has a policy about it, which policy is best. Same thing with land value taxation. If you argue that taxation in general is bad and there shouldn't be any government, that's a different argument, right? So those who advocate a land value tax do so as a replacement of all other taxes. Right? So, for example, other proposed reforms are a flat rate income tax or a national sales tax. Now, those who argue in favor of a land value tax have a few arguments. First of all, a tax on land value has no deadweight loss, in contrast to a tax on income, sales, or produced goods like buildings, because the amount of spatial land is fixed, and if you tax land value, you don't get less land, it doesn't run away, and it doesn't hide. Now, how it would be implemented, in the United States, property taxes are collected by counties, and a land value tax would operate similar to a property tax on real estate, except that buildings would be exempt. You would only tax the value of land. It would be assessed at the county level and collected at the county level and then sent up to higher levels of government and down to lower levels of government. And also, as today with property taxes, if you feel that your assessment is unfair or inaccurate, you could appeal it to a board of appeals or ultimately to a jury. Now, another aspect of land value taxation that makes it better than other taxes is that government's public goods, the security, fire protection, streets, schooling, and all that, government's public goods, to the extent that they make locations more attractive and more productive, generate higher rent and higher land value. And if they're paid for mostly by taxes on labor and goods and business profits, then in effect, landowners are subsidized. They get higher rent and land value in exchange for nothing, just having title. So without a land value tax, government spending amounts to a subsidy to land ownership, and if free marketeers are opposed to subsidies, then they should favor land value taxes over all taxes, or as Milton Friedman put it, the least worst tax is on land value because it has no deadweight loss and it avoids the subsidy to landowners. Now, the argument that we shouldn't have land taxes because we shouldn't have any taxes is really an argument against government, not land value taxation as such. The equivalent of a land value tax in the case of a stateless society would be for property owners to pay for the services, instead of having them subsidized, as is the case now. For example, in a stateless society, people will still want civic goods. They would want streets, they would want security, they would want fire protection, they might like parks nearby. And so without any taxes on sales or income, value added, or goods, the landowners would have to pay for those services that affect their land. And that would eliminate the subsidy. And the main aim of land value taxation is to prevent the subsidy to landowners. One of the harmful effects of subsidizing land value is it generates boom and bust cycles. We saw the crash of 2008 following a real estate bubble, and the main cause of that bubble was that much of the gains from economic expansion is captured by higher rent and land value, and then speculators jump on top of that to gain using leverage, and that creates the real estate bubble. And if you look at the history of the United States for the past 200 years, every real estate bubble has been followed by panic or depression. So in a stateless society, right, the financing for collective goods would be much closer to a land value tax than the case is today, because landowners would have to finance their own services. Leo Tolstoy, who was an admirer and follower of Henry George, Tolstoy said that nobody really argues against land value taxation. People simply just don't understand it. And that's the case with arguments today. I've never seen a real argument against land value taxation. They basically misunderstand it. For example, the opponents of land value taxation argue that the supply of land is not really fixed because entrepreneurs can create more land value by chopping down trees, by draining swamps or so on, by leveling the ground. But these improvements are not, land in economics means natural resources. So improvements are capital goods, and they would not be subject to a land value tax because they are not land. Now, a landlord as a person can also be an entrepreneur. He seeks out the best tenants, he manages the property, and so on. Well, he's engaging in labor, and the return on that effort is wages, right? So a land value tax would not affect the return on the labor of the landlord. We're talking about the role of a landowner and not a particular person who happens to have other roles also. There's a now the opponents of land value taxation say, well, there's plenty of unused land. Land is not a problem because you can expand into deserts or mountains or the ocean. There's a lot of land available. Well, that's irrelevant. The issue is that to replace other taxes with land value taxation to make the economy more efficient, to create more freedom, a less complex system. The fact that there's unused land is not relevant. That's submarginal land, which is of little value because it's not being used. There's a moral argument for land value taxation in contrast to taxing wages and income and goods, and that is self-ownership. The taxation of wages and goods bought from wages violates self-ownership. But self-ownership cannot extend to what the self did not create, namely the land value. And so the moral case for land value taxation is that if you agree with human equality, then we should have an equal benefit from natural resources. And the value of natural resources is reflected in the rent paid to use those resources. Rent is a surplus. There's an economic surplus. Marx misidentified it as wages that were unjustly taken by the capitalists, but Henry George, the American economist of the 1800s, correctly identified the surplus of the economy as land rent. Today, economists call the surplus consumer and producer surplus. In a competitive industry, that so-called producer surplus is really land rent, and therefore it can be tapped without harming enterprise. Another aspect is that nobody goes to prison for not paying a property tax. People go to prison for not paying an income tax. But if you don't pay the property tax, there are several consequences. One is that you simply don't get services. Another possibility is, say, for elderly people whose income is lower, their property tax can be deferred until the property is sold, or the property there can be a lien on the property if the taxes aren't paid. So even if the property is sold in order to pay off the property tax, at least the people who own it don't go to jail. So that's the case in favor of land value taxation. So I finished early.
Yep, you still have 5 minutes. So you're done?
I'm done, yeah.
All right, cool. So
Well, I guess it's my turn.
yeah, hold on one sec. Let me just make this one.
Okay. Oh, you have to introduce me, right? Okay.
Yes.
Oh,
Walter Block.
right.
Okay, now we're ready. Go ahead.
Well, in a sense, I really shouldn't be in this debate because Fred wants me to adopt a position that I don't really want to adopt. He wants me to assume that we should have government and that we should have some sort of tax, and he's saying, well, the land tax is the least bad of all the taxes. And as far as I'm concerned, it's sort of like, which way would you rather die, assuming that you were given a pill that it was painless? Would you rather be beheaded?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
I'm sorry. The question is, which way would you rather die? And there are 10, 20 different ways to die. In a motor vehicle crash, by shooting. And assuming that none of them would hurt, my answer is, well, I don't really care. So as an anarchist, I'm sort of put in a ticklish position or a rough position. And what Fred is saying is, look, given that you have to have taxes, what would you like? And I say, I don't like any of them. And and then Fred would say, well, then you're not really in the discussion. And maybe I'm not a good debating partner for Fred because I don't really want to be in that discussion. Because I'm against all taxes. I don't think any of these taxes are moral. I don't think any of them give a subsidy to anybody by not taxing people. I think I disagree with Fred on that. I'm not sure I understood it fully, but if you think that by not taxing somebody you're giving them a subsidy, then that really assumes that the government owns the entire GDP, and then when they don't take what really is theirs, then they're giving it to you. But I don't assume that the government owns the entire GDP. I assume that they're a bunch of I don't know, criminals, and they shouldn't own anything. I guess if you put a gun to my head and said, look, we got to have taxes, I would just say let's have the lowest possible taxes. Murray Rothbard, I have in front of me Murray's criticism of the reply to George's criticisms, and I just read it and I thought it was magnificent. And Fred, one of the questions I'll ask you, and when your turn comes you could answer it if you would. Here is the thing, I'll just put it up on the screen. Has anyone written a rebuttal of this? Can you see it? It's Murray Rothbard's The Single Tax, Economic and Moral Implications, and a reply to George's criticisms. It's in his Logic of Action 1, pages 294 to 310. I'd be very curious if anyone on your side of this, a Georgist, has written a critique of that. I read it, and it just sort of seems, to knock the single tax out of the park. I suppose if I had to pick taxes, first of all, I would say the lowest possible. And here again, I'm guided by Murray Rothbard, who was such a moderate pinko because he compromised and he said he'd be willing to go back to George Washington's budget as a first step. So he's not really a full anarchist. A full anarchist would say no taxes, but Murray, bless his heart, said he'd be willing to go back to George Washington's taxes. And, I guess it was like 30,000 or so. I suppose, we could pay 30,000. But forgetting about how much, and I imagine maybe Fred agrees with me, he's a free enterpriser after all, that the less taxes, the better. So suppose that someone pulled a gun on me and said, we have to have taxes, and what kind would you have? I certainly wouldn't want to have 100% tax on anything, because if you had 100% tax, as Murray says, you get no revenue. And now I'm becoming a statist, and we want to have money for the government. God help me, I have my fingers crossed here. I hope I'll be forgiven by the anarchist gods. But if you have 100% tax, when we draw the what's that called? The Laffer Curve. When we draw the Laffer Curve, we say that if the tax is 100%, the government gets nothing. And if the tax is zero, the government gets nothing. And therefore, the tax can't be either 100% or zero if the government is to get anything. So we have to have some sort of moderate tax. So that's why they call me Walter Moderate Block. I'm no extremist. Fred's a maniac. I hope you take this in the way I mean it. I'm not really saying you're a maniac. I'm just sort of teasing. I think Fred and I are good friends. We agree on 99.8% of everything. So this sort of within the family debate. It's not as if either of us are debating a commie or a Marxist. So I would say if you had to have taxes, keep them as low as possible and sort of diversify. It's sort of my advice if you're investing, should you invest in gold or real estate or bonds or something? I'd say, get 5 things and put 1/5 of your money in all of them. So I guess I would say, let's have a little income tax, God forbid, and let's have a little sales tax, God forbid, and a little land tax, God forbid, and a little this tax and a little that tax, and sort of let it go at that. But the idea that we should put all of our tax eggs in one basket and have 100% tax, I think, is problematic. Another criticism I have of Fred's view, or the Georgist view, is he says that land is fixed. Well, he admits that there is submarginal land, so in a sense we can get more and more land because not all of it is used. And then also it's possible to get land out of the water. I don't know if you count water as land. I'm now doing a book on privatizing oceans, so I'm a little confused as to what that is. But we could drain the swamps and get rid of the wetlands. There are no swamps anymore. They're just wetlands. And I think who are those guys, the Dutch or the Holland people or somebody, get more land out of the North Sea or some sea near where they are? So you can get more land that way, and you can also get more land on the moon or Mars or some, I don't know, asteroid or what have you. So I don't think land is exactly fixed, although it's pretty much fixed. It depends upon the price. He says buildings would be exempt, but Murray Rothbard makes the very good point that it's hard to tell the difference between what the land or the site value is and what the other value is. And then Fred says, well, you can always appeal, but you can appeal your tax assessment, but there's no objective criteria. We Austrians, or I don't know if Fred's an Austrian, but I certainly am, and there we have subjective values. So you really can't say, well, the objective value is that the land is $1 million and the site value is $2 million, or vice versa, or anything like that. So it's sort of a gray area, and you really can't tell. What else? Oh yeah, now this bit about civic goods, streets, fire protection, police, that people would have to pay anyway. Well, if we privatize this stuff, we pay less. I think that for any given thing, whether it's streets or fire protection or garbage collection or whatever, if we privatized everything and landowners had to pay a fee, I think the fee would be, maybe 1/5 of what the government would charge you through taxes. But now I'm getting off the point, or at least the point that Fred wants me to stay on, because I'm getting back into anarchism. I'm saying we should privatize everything, and so I'll try to stick closer to to what Fred wants me to, since he's a good guy and I want to be his friend. Now this bit about boom and bust cycles, I'm an Austrian economist. I'm a Hayekian or Misesian or Rothbardian on this. I think that the reason we have business cycles is because the Fed artificially lowers interest rates and induces and entices people to make malinvestments which are unsustainable. And that's the Austrian business cycle theory in 30 seconds. And I don't understand how land could create a business cycle. Maybe Fred in his next go-round can maybe more elaborate on that. The moral argument, I don't really get the moral argument for land tax or for non-ownership of land, since you didn't create it. There's lots of stuff we don't create. I didn't create Mozart. I came in as a baby and I learned to love Mozart. I didn't create it, and yet I benefit from it. I didn't create it. Just because I didn't create the land, I don't see why I can't own it in the sense that I can own Mozart's music or own. I mean, we're all beneficiaries of civilization, and our forefathers invested and created capital goods, and that's why we're a lot richer than we would otherwise be had they not done that. And this bit about equality, maybe I misheard Fred, but I'm not really a big fan of equality. I don't see why everyone should own 1/7 billionth of everything. assuming there are 7 billion people, and assuming that's what Fred means, although I'm not sure, so maybe Fred could elaborate that on his next turn. I'm not a real big fan of equality. What I usually use on my students who are egalitarians, I say, look, most of you have 2 eyes, and there are blind people. Suppose I would have, take one of your eyes, you wouldn't lose too much, ha ha ha, in terms of comparing incomparables, and the blind person would gain a lot. So therefore, we should have an eye tax, and hopefully to get them out of their egalitarianism in that way. And there is a bit of egalitarianism in the Georgia system in the sense that since no one individual created the land, God created the land, or nature created the land, or whoever created the land, society should own it. But, there's no such thing as society. There's just us folks, as our President Obama would say, talking about folks. There's just us folks, and I don't see why, as Murray says again, I'm relying on Murray's essay here, why should a Pakistani baby own some land in Iowa? And of course, why should an Iowan baby get to own some land in Pakistan? Why shouldn't people get to own the land with which they mix their labor? I'm a big fan of John Locke and Murray Rothbard in terms of how do you get to own land. And you get to own land by mixing your labor with it, and I think that's a great system. And to have 100% tax on it, would be highly problematic. Now, also, I think that the Georgists make the mistake of thinking that the landowner provides no service, that there's no dead weight loss if we get rid of the speculator. Oh, and I didn't like that point about speculators. I'm a big fan of speculators. I think speculators are great guys. They, keep prices from oscillating too much because if they expect prices to go up, they sell stuff and they keep the prices down. So if you don't have speculation, you have oscillations of prices, and if you do have speculation, that prices are more level. The other point. About prison. I mean, if you don't pay, I don't see why you don't go to prison if you don't pay your tax. I mean, it's true you have a capital value in the land, and they could just sort of seize it, but they could do that with, look, if Bill Gates doesn't pay his taxes, he's going to jail, even though he's got a lot of money, and the government could garnish his salary or garnish whatever he's got, and, just sort of grab his bank account. So I don't see why we don't have prison. Now, with regard to the entrepreneurial effort, what Murray is emphasizing is that the function of the landowner is to make sure that the person who values the land most gets it, and that way we maximize the GDP. Now, again, I'm not saying Fred wants us to have a comparative system, and I'm only talking about the land tax because that's our debate. And he could rightly say, well, look, if you look at all these other taxes, taxes on labor, taxes on capital, taxes on, income, whatever, consumption, they too have their problems. And I'd be the first to agree with him if he said that they also have problems. But we're now just talking about the land tax. And the way I see it, Fred is saying land tax, or land tax, and he's saying the land tax is relatively great. And I don't see that. I see the land taxes, not so good. As an anarchist, I'm against all taxes, and I don't see any reason to, uniquely pick out the land tax and say, oh, this is wonderful and all the other taxes are crappy. I think they're all crappy and roughly equally crappy, although I've not really done any research as to which tax is worse than the other for a given amount of tax revenue for the government. That's a whole specialized area in public finance. I'm not really into that. In graduate school, I did that stuff. One more point about leaving land idle. Fred didn't mention this, but in the Georgia's literature, leaving land idle is somehow a particular non-kosher type sin. But Fred did quite properly say that there is land that's submarginal, and the submarginal land would be idle, of course. But then even non-submarginal land, like say the land right in the middle of Manhattan somewhere, or the land in the middle of Chicago, or in some good place. Well, some guy moves out, let's say he's renting the land or whatever, and the owner doesn't really know right offhand, like with the snap of a fingers, who is the best buyer, and should he make a short-term contract or a long-term contract? Should he sell it to this guy, to that guy, because everyone's offering different kinds of combinations and payments. So I don't think that idle land is a problem as long as it's voluntarily idle land. Okay, now I don't know how much of my time has gone by, and I haven't heard the bell, so I think I'm under 15 minutes, but I think I'm roughly equivalent with Fred. So I'll stop now and let him have his turn.
Great. Good. Now 10
Okay.
minutes. All right, ready?
Yes, ready. All right. First of all, I'm not assuming that we should have a government or a state. It's conditional logic. If X, then Y. If there is a government that's collecting revenue, then which source is the least worst? That's the question Milton Friedman asked, and his answer was a land value tax. So if Milton Friedman said so and Adam Smith said so, well, these are, you have to have a pretty good reason to disagree with these two. Now, the thing with the land tax is that once it's in place, even the owner does not really have a burden. And the reason is that a tax on land value reduces the price of land. This is an opposite from a tax on produced goods. If there's a sales tax on computers, you have to pay the cost of production plus the tax. If there's a tax on land value, there's no cost of producing land, so the value can fall all the way down to zero and the land will still sit there. Therefore, as the price of land goes down, you don't have to pay as much to purchase land, so therefore the effect of a land tax is to replace what would have been paid in mortgage interest. So even with a high land tax, after the transition, when the new buyer pays the lower price of land, there's no burden in general, even on the landowner. Now, Walter asked, what is this about the subsidy? The goods provided by government to the degree that they are useful, and sometimes they are, like bridges, and highways do get used. These collective goods, infrastructure, schools, protection, so on, these all make locations more attractive and more productive, and therefore the rent and land value goes up. So the government provision of useful collective goods increases land rent and land value. If the landowner doesn't pay for it, then he's in effect subsidized, and the worker-tenant gets double billed. The worker-tenant has to pay higher rent to be located there and the taxes that pay for those goods. All right, now, with respect to Murray Rothbard had stated that if you have 100% tax on the land rent, the economic rent of land, then you'll get no tax at all because the landowner will just charge zero since he can't keep the rent. And also, Walter mentioned the Laffer Curve, that if you tax 100% of something, you get nothing because people won't do it. However, Rothbard misunderstands how a tax on land value is applied. As Leo Trotsky said, people just don't understand it. The land value tax would be based on the assessment of land value when put to its highest use. In other words, when put to its best use, how much would people pay rent for this plot of land? That would be the basis for the tax, not the current use or what a particular tenant pays for a particular landlord. And that's how property taxes are actually applied in most places today. A property appraiser or assessor will estimate the value of land when it's put to its highest and best use. So a vacant lot in the middle of a city next to a tall building will have the same land value even if the vacant lot is empty and not being used for anything. So therefore, Rothbard is wrong. A high tax on land value or rent would collect revenue because it doesn't depend on the actual current use. Now, Walter asked, where has this argument been rebutted, or has it been? Yeah, there's a book called Critics of Henry George, and the arguments of people like Frank Knight, Murray Rothbard, many others, all of these arguments against land value taxation, they're all there. All of them are rebutted. So you can see that in that book and other articles also. I mean, there's been rebuttals in other places also, but that would be the best first place to look. Now, the statement that I want taxes to be as low as possible, right, which implies government spending is as low as possible, that's not an argument for or against land value taxation. The amount of tax is not at issue. The question here is, given that the government is going to have some tax, which tax is the least worst? Now, a low income tax is worse than a low land tax, and the reason is because once you have an income tax, you then have the possibility of cheating or people not paying their taxes, a tax evasion instead of just avoidance. And therefore, you need a government police force to check on people to see whether they pay their taxes. We now, and these restrictions and regulations and mandates grow every year. We now have people in foreign countries with bank accounts in foreign banks. These foreign banks now have to report to the U.S. government all the details of the account holders' personal finances. With a land tax, only the land within the United States would be taxed. Americans who live abroad would be untouched. And you also have, with a land tax, no reporting requirements. With an income tax, you have to write down all your expenses, all your incomes. You have to report it, subject to penalties. With a land tax, there's no record keeping, no reporting. You simply you get a bill and you pay it. If you don't want to pay, if you think it's too high, you can appeal it to a board or ultimately to a jury. So that would make, a low land tax better than a low income tax. Again, the issue is not the size of government. The issue is a comparative analysis among different kinds of taxes. So there's no Laffer curve with respect to land value taxation. Right? In fact, that's one of the few taxes, maybe the only one, where there's no Laffer curve, because the land rent is a surplus, the amount of land is fixed. You can tax almost all the land value or all the land rent. The land is still there. It doesn't change the market rent. It reduces the purchase price of land, but the market rent does not get affected. The cost of producing goods in that location is not affected. There's no Laffer curve with respect to a land value taxation. Now, another thing is complexity. A single tax on land value would be the simplest tax to levy. If you have like a low assortment of taxes, a low sales tax, a low income tax, a low tax on buildings, you create tax complexity. It becomes impossible to know how much taxes you're paying. I'd like to ask Walter, have you calculated the total amount of taxes you paid last year to all levels of government? Well, nobody does it. It's too difficult. With a property tax, you know exactly how much you pay, and the ideal is to collect it monthly, so it becomes like a utility bill and not. See, the trouble in California, for example, where I live, by law, the property tax is levied twice a year in large payments, right? But if it's levied monthly, it can even be deducted from your bank account or salary as income taxes now are. It can be made convenient. Now about what is land. Land, the economic meaning of land is all natural resources. So that includes not just the solid surface we walk on. The oceans are land, right? Wildlife is land. The electromagnetic spectrum is land. Anything that's a natural resource, not produced by human action, is land. So now, when the Dutch did not create any more land. When they put a dike around the ocean, when they drained off the water and put farms in or buildings there, they're not creating more space. The space was already there. They're changing the stuff in that space. And all those improvements are capital goods and would not be subject to a tax on the land value. Now, as far as the subjective value of land, well, you could say, yes, all values are well, all values to individuals are subjective. There's, the only origin of value is the subjective value of individuals. I agree with that. That's a basic Austrian concept. But if I were to say, if I have an ounce of gold, and I say, what's the market value of that gold? And an Austrian would say, it's impossible to know the market value of an ounce of gold because the value is subjective. Maybe if you sell it, then you'll see a particular market price. Well, but I can go to a coin dealer and say, here's an ounce of gold. What do you think it would fetch? He would tell me because there's a global market price for gold. Now, a particular ounce of gold might sell differently if somebody is willing to pay a higher price, but you can generally estimate the market price of a lot of goods by comparing it to equivalent sales that have taken place. Similarly with real estate. Now, if there are professional appraisers that tell you the value is daily.
Here, you can finish your thought.
Yeah, but so there are professional appraisers of real estate. They are there for private person reasons as well as government. For example, for inheritance or for fire insurance, you need to estimate the value of what can burn down. So these appraisers have professional techniques, comparative sales, replacement value of buildings, and so on. They can give you an estimate of the property value. It's not an exact science, but it's good enough for commercial reasons and good enough if you want to have a tax based on the land value. And there are cities that only tax land value, not buildings, and there are professional appraisers or assessors that do it, not absolutely perfectly, but good enough for practical purposes.
Okay, let me, my turn now, I guess.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to compliment Fred. I was in a debate with some guy, some Randy, and we were practically screaming at each other. So it's a pleasure to have Fred as my debating partner because I think we're both trying to get at the truth of these things, and we share enough common values so that we don't think the other guy is a commie or whatever. We realize that this is within the family kind of a dispute, and although sometimes within the family disputes get pretty hot, but I don't think this one is getting hot. And I like this type of a debate where it's an intellectual debate, and so I appreciate Fred, and I hope he appreciates my contribution in this way as well. Okay, now on to the specifics. I'd like to ask Fred a favor. If you would email me some of the literature where they've criticized Murray. I tried to write down what you said, but I didn't get it all. If you would, give me the sites so that I could look them up. That book where it attacked Murray and some other people, I'd appreciate that, and I think that would be helpful. Now, Fred started off by saying anything favored by Milton Friedman and Adam Smith can't be all bad, if I can put words in his mouth. That was the gist of what he said. Well, I'm not a real big fan of Milton Friedman. Let me just mention a few deviations of my man Milton from the good and true free market. He favors antitrust. He favors the volunteer military, not only on the grounds of freedom, but also in order to make the Vietnam War run more efficiently, which I don't like. He favored the negative income tax, not just the land tax. He also favored tax withholding, and he apologized for that later. And now Fred is saying, well, tax withholding is a good thing because it makes it easier for you to pay your taxes. Well, I don't want it easy to pay taxes. I don't want it simplified. I want it to be complex and a pain in the neck because I want taxes reduced. So Fred and I have a different view on that. Milton Friedman is a road socialist. He favors government highways, and I think Fred does too, although I'm not sure about that. He keeps talking about collective goods like schools and roads and police and fire. When I hear collective goods, I start reaching for my wallet or start seeing how many fingers I've got because I'm afraid somebody's grabbing them because, collective goods is just public choice socialism as far as I could see, and I'm not a big fan of that. But then again, Fred might say, well, if you're going to have taxes, we might as well spend it on something, and what else are you going to spend it on except that? But I keep saying, well, but I just have an article, a book out on private roads. Milton Friedman is also a little weak on money. Murray Rothbard has this thing that people specialize in what they're in the worst in. Now, Milton Friedman was really good on, a whole bunch of things like minimum wage and free trade and rent control. But what does he spend most of his time on? On money and on voucher systems, which is just school socialism. He also favors Ronald Coase, who I think is a commie, and Milton Friedman said we're all Keynesians now, and I don't like that. And I once asked him about the passion for justice. I said, what motivates your passion for justice? He says, well, passion for justice will kill us all, and he's against justice. So I'm not a real big fan of Milton Friedman. So just because Milton Friedman favors this, that would pretty much dispose me against it, although not quite, because there are worse people than Milton Friedman. Which reminds me of a joke, which I'm sure Fred will like. The Economist is asked, how is your wife? And his answer is, compare to what? And Fred is, I think he doesn't have blood. He's got comparativeness in his veins running through it, if I could say that about you without getting you angry at me. And I see you smiling, so I think you take that as accurate assessment. Mm-hmm. Now, this bit about, he says, well, there's cheating with the income tax. Well, there could be cheating with the land tax, because remember, Fred is sort of living or dying by the assessor. And I agree that in the private market, assessment is, a perfectly good thing. There are real estate assessors and people who can assess the value of gold and all that. But when we come to taxes, this is just rampant for bribery. In British Columbia, there's this thing called the Agricultural Land Reserve, ALR, Agricultural Land Reserve. And the law in Canada is you have to keep land in agriculture because, we need agriculture. You can't truck stuff in from 200 miles away. So right around Vancouver, which is a very high real estate market, you've got these farms. And then the big thing is to somehow convert agricultural land reserve into use for whatever you want to do it. Now, as farmland, an acre is worth, I don't know, 10, 15,000, something like that. But you got land right touching on Vancouver, which is worth millions per acre. And if you can get somebody in the assembly or the parliament that they've got there to say, well, this square mile over here, we're taking it out of the land reserve because of yak, whatever reasons. And now there's all sorts of bribery going on. So I agree that there's cheating on the income tax, although when you cheat on the income tax, I don't know if I'd want to use the word cheating. I think I'd want to use the word keeping your own private property. But in terms of chicanery, there's going to be that as well. I didn't understand the water versus land business, and I'm happy to be corrected by Fred. I now see his point about when you move the wetlands or the water away, you're not creating any more land because water is land, and I didn't see that point, so I thank you for that point. But still, I'm not sure about Mars and the moon. Right now, if I go to Mars and the moon and I think that I can homestead some of it and I can get to own it, I have an incentive to go do it. Whereas if Fred's government tells me, well, they're going to tax 100% of what they think the value of it is, I'm much less likely to do it. So I think there are incentives there. And I don't think that Fred replied sufficiently to my point about the entrepreneurship, that when you own land now without 100% tax, and I also agree with Fred about the Laffer Curve. I see your point that if it's 100% tax and it's free, well, then there'll be zero collection for government. But, and Fred quite rightly says, but tut, not so fast, if I could put words in his mouth again, namely the government will assess it. They'll say, well, look, you say that the land is worth nothing right in the middle of Manhattan, say, and we say it's worth, 10 million. Well, now, that's true. Now they can collect taxes on the 10 million, but that 10 million is very arbitrary. I don't care how many assessors you've got. Some will say 5, some will say 15, and then there's going to be bribery and chicanery and all sorts of craziness regarding that. Although I agree again on the reporting requirements, you wouldn't have to report anything. The government, the revenue is to just come and say, hey, that's how much you owe. So this idea of making it a monthly and making it easy to pay taxes, I think is problematic, whereas Fred sees it as a positive. Although I certainly agree with Fred when he says, it's really hard to calculate how much taxes you're paying because it's also implicit in everything you buy, and every time you breathe, you pay taxes. I'm kidding about that. What else do I have? Oh yeah, Adam Smith. I started off because Fred started off by saying Milton Friedman and Adam Smith are great guys, and Adam Smith is a great guy, and Milton Friedman was a great guy in some ways, but they all had what is it, clay feet or Achilles tendon? Not Achilles tendons, Achilles heels or something. Adam Smith was he believed in the labor theory of value. He was not an anarchist, which means problems, and he believed that the government should do this and that and the other. Although obviously he was good at some things. Look, you don't get to be called Mr. Libertarian like Milton Friedman was improperly called if you're against freedom in every regard. But So I think it's weak reads on Fred's part to rely on Milton Friedman and Adam Smith. I'd much rather rely on Mises and Rothbard as my heroes, mentors, gurus, because I think that their claim to be libertarians is much stronger. I think I'm. Oh yeah, I did mention the prison business. I don't see why you can't go to prison if you don't pay your land tax. It's true that they can seize your land, but I think they could put you in prison as Irwin Schiff, I don't know, went to prison because he didn't pay his income tax. If he didn't pay his land tax, I think they would have put him in jail there as well. Okay, I'm finished with my turn.
Okay, great. So, one sec.
Okay,
now 5 minutes concluding remarks.
Yeah, Walter mentioned that private provision is better, and I'm a fan of privatization and private goods. I wrote a book on private communities. So I fully agree that we can have private roads, we can have private infrastructure, but then if we, and so that's not the issue. The issue is not whether we should have government or private items. The issue is, given that there's government, what's the best source of revenue? And also the fact that if things are private, then there's no subsidy. If there's a private road and somebody pays a toll, right, there's no subsidy involved there, whereas with government, you have an implicit subsidy to landowners. Now, with respect to the business cycle, I agree with the Austrian theory of the business cycle. But when the Austrians talk about the structure of capital goods and artificially lower interest rates affecting the higher order capital goods, empirically, the main capital good affected is real estate construction and real estate buildings. And and also the conventional Austrian theory leaves out the land, which should be put in. I, in fact, wrote a synthesis of the Austrians' business cycle theory and the Georgist cycle theory with respect that does include land value, and put them, because when you have cheap credit, artificially cheap credit, it does raise the land value. It's not the building value that's going up, it's the land value that's going up, and the bubble is a land value bubble. So that's fully consistent with the Austrian theory. In fact, it enhances it. Now, with respect to the moral argument about equality is that I think you'd agree, we have equal self-ownership. If you don't have equality, then you have masters and slaves, right? So we are equal with respect to our self-ownership, but the self-ownership does not extend to land. So these homesteading theories of land ownership are all problematic. Now, the George's case for taxing land or collecting the land rent is not collective ownership of the land. You would have individual possession. You can distinguish between rights of possession and rights to the yield of the land. So even if the yield is either collected and distributed equally or used for collective goods or civic goods, the possession and control of land and transfer is still individual. That's what creates the efficiency of the market. Now, now the landowner as the entrepreneur. Once again, if the person who has title to land is also an entrepreneur, right, developing the land, that is a different role, and his return is wages or entrepreneurial profits, which would not be taxed. So you have to distinguish what Austrians call an ideal type, or the role that you play in the economy, versus the person who can play various different roles. Now, with respect to idle land, vacant land, if you have an empty lot in the middle of the city, its value is going up because of the greater population or the greater commerce or the greater infrastructure or services provided for that land. The landlord does nothing to make that value. It's basically a windfall for the landowner. And what harm does it do to have a vacant lot in the middle of the city? Well, the harm is the production or residency that could take place that doesn't take place. So if you don't have the subsidy from government provision of collective goods, then it's not really a problem. The problem is the subsidy that increases the land value from taxes paid for by others. In a purely private setting, it would not be a problem. Now, the book that I mentioned, the best source for examining arguments, rebuttals to the arguments against land value taxation is Critics of Henry George. Critics of Henry George. I can email you the details about that, but you can easily look up that book, Critics of Henry George.
Let me interrupt you. Who was the editor of it?
Editor was Andelson, A-N-D-E-L-S-O-N.
Okay, thanks.
Robert Andelson. He was actually a Mises person in Alabama.
Thank you.
Now, I agree that. Oh, all right.
You want to finish?
I just wanted to say that there's given an income tax, people will cheat or not pay, and because that's people feel it's really their money and really is, but there's no tax evasion with a land value tax, and therefore the problem with tax evasion is you create a government police force to enforce it, and they intrude into your life. Banks are reporting on our accounts without our knowledge. In fact, they're not even supposed to inform you that they're reporting on our accounts. There's all kinds of invasion of privacy, and you have to reveal all your financial stuff to the government. So with a land value tax, it's totally private. They don't care who owns the land. As long as whoever has title pays the bill, it could be a dummy name.
All right.
Okay, my turn. Strictly speaking, is it my turn now?
Yep.
Okay, strictly speaking, we're not supposed to interrupt each other, and I was guilty of interrupting, but I hope that it was seen as a sort of a friendly interrupt, just
No
ask
problem.
for the editor.
Yeah.
I've been in debates where people interrupt and won't shut up, and so I think it's very different. I hope you'll forgive me for that interruption.
No problem.
It was an attempt to, help elaborate your point, I guess. Okay, I agree with you that they now call it earlier orders rather than higher orders, thanks to Roger Garrison with the triangle, but higher orders is fine, and I don't see why land shouldn't be in there, and I think most Austrians would agree with you that land is, in effect, very heavily affected by the interest rate, and it certainly should be put into the Austrian business cycle. And I've read that piece that you wrote, and I thought it was very good, but I don't think that the Austrians were against it, and maybe they didn't emphasize it, but they certainly talk about capital goods, and land is, in effect, a capital good. Now, this business of possession versus yield, there was this very famous philosopher named Norman Malcolm, and his professor, who was a cousin of Hayek, I just can't remember his name, a very even more famous philosopher, walked down the street and said, I'll give you those trees, or I'll give you those cars, or whatever they passed on their walk, provided that you don't interfere with the previous owner's decision of what to do with those trees or those cars, and provided you don't try to sell it to anyone. And the point that this philosopher was making to his then student Norman Malcolm is, possession and yield are a lot closer than Fred seems to think. I mean, if you can't get the yield, then in what sense are you really the possessor of it? I mean, the point is that I don't really own my car if I can't prevent the previous owner of the car from riding around in it, and I can't sell the car. In what sense am I really the owner of it? And Fred says, well, I am the owner of it. It's just that I can't get the yield of it. Well, then maybe I'm not really the owner of it, because the two are intimately connected. Then there's this business of equality. Now, I agree we all should have equality in the sense that everyone has an equal right to be left alone. We have an equal right to not be murdered, not be raped, whatever. But that's about as far as it goes, whereas I think that the Georgists are saying much more than that. They're saying we should have an equal right to the yield of real estate, because real estate goes up and it's not the benefit of, it's not due to the ownership, because the ownership is sort of neutral. Doesn't really do anything to increase the value. It's rather because of population increasing. And he's really coming out in the Georgists, and I think Fred are saying that not only do we have an equal right to have negative rights, namely right not to be killed, murdered, raped, stolen from, but we have an equal right to the yield of land, and I find that highly problematic. Let me read a quote from Murray. Murray says, we can accept the premise that land is God-given, but we cannot therefore infer that it's given to society. It is given for the use of individual persons. Talent, health, beauty may all also be said to be God-given, but obviously they are properties of individuals, not of society. Society cannot own anything. When society owns anything, in effect, what happens is the people responsible for the use of it, namely the government bureaucrats or the government politicians, they're the ones that get to own this stuff. So the idea that I'm not sure whether this goes just for a country or this goes for the whole world. If it goes for a country, I don't see why somebody in West Virginia should get to own an equal part of the very more valuable land in New York City. And if it goes for the whole world, again, the Iowa baby and the Pakistani baby. The Iowa baby, for reasons in history, is going to be brought up in a much richer environment than the Pakistani baby for historical reasons. And to think that they should have an equal right to the 1/7 billionth of all the land, I think is certainly not compatible with libertarianism. Now, I also accuse Fred of getting into this market failure business. Now, I'm a big opponent of market failure. I don't think there's any such thing as market failure. I don't. What are the main market failures? Well, monopoly, public goods, externalities. I don't know, asymmetrical information. Those are the top 3 or 4. I don't think there's any such thing as market failure. I mean, yes, there are individuals who fail. The entrepreneur fails because he doesn't foresee consumer desires, but that's not what the economist profession means by a market failure. What they mean is some sort of systematic failure of the market, as in the case of monopoly or externalities or public goods or so-called collective goods, and I don't like that phrase too much. Let me just get 30 more seconds, okay? The specific thing is that my claim is that in the free market you'll have the optimal amount of idle land, and Fred is saying the optimal amount of idle land is 0. And so he's in effect saying that the idleness of the land that the market throws up is a market failure.
All right. Do you guys want to do Q&A or?
Fred, why are you so silly as to believe in your views? No, I'm kidding. I wouldn't ask a question like that.
Let me just respond to some of these other points, if I may.
Is that okay with you, Walter?
Sure. Let's have one more go round, and maybe then maybe we'll start repeating ourselves. So let Fred have a few minutes, and then I'll have a few minutes. And
you mentioned, I think. You mentioned some problem in Canada or UK where agricultural land was taxed this way and other land that way. Yes, that's right. But land value taxation, the pure land value tax would be regardless of the actual use. So whether your land was agricultural, urban, whatever, it wouldn't matter. All that would matter was how much is the rent and land value. Now, on homesteading the moon, first of all, the first people who would arrive at the moon would be a rent-free margin of production. There'd be no rent. As long as there was plenty of land of that quality left on the moon, there'd be no rent and therefore no tax. The only time the rent would go up would be if you had like a city on the moon. If you established a community, then within that community, land would be scarcer. But just going to the moon and establishing some kind of mining or whatever, it would be rent-free as long as there'd be other land, like John Locke said, other land of just as good. So there'd be no problem homesteading the moon. I'm not against homesteading. When I go into a theater and if there's an empty seat, I homestead it, right? Somebody else can't sit there. I say I'm already here, but that doesn't mean it's mine in perpetuity. Now, land value, in a proper system of land value taxation, the assessment of land value would be a public record available to anybody. If you felt your land was improperly assessed, higher than your neighbors, you could appeal it, as I said. So therefore, in terms of unfairness or government abuse, the ability to look at your land publicly, compare it to your neighbor, and appeal it would prevent this kind of abuse, or at least minimize it. Now, the French physiocrats were one of the first to propose a single tax on land value. They called it the impôt unique in French. They call it the net product, but that's really land rent. And they gave us the term laissez-faire, laissez-passer. So it's not just Friedman and Smith. You know, they have their faults, but it even goes back to the physiocrats. Now, so I'm not basing an argument on Smith and George, maybe, and Friedman. Maybe they weren't good examples to bring up in this context. But anyway, they were, you know, somewhat free market. Now, you can also distinguish between the natural rent based on the, you know, the climate, the natural features of land, and the local rent. The local rent generated by population, commerce, and infrastructure. That rent would not be distributed worldwide. That would be used locally, either for distribution locally or for the provision of civic goods. The natural rent, due to what nature provides, ideally would be used, would be shared globally, but that would be kind of an ideal, probably not practical in today's world. Now, I completely share your views on market failure. My book, Public Goods and Private Communities, argued against market failure. I don't think pure free markets fail, so that's really not really relevant. The argument for land value taxation is not a market failure argument. It's an argument of, given that there's public revenue, what's the least worst source? And in an anarchist setting, you know, when people pay for local civic goods, you know, would they prefer paying based on their personal consumption or personal income, or on the value of the good you're using? If I go to a hotel and I say I'd like a room, and they say, how much was your income last year? We'll do it as a percentage of that income. I would say, first of all, it's none of your business. Secondly, what's my income got to do with this hotel room? I'm going to pay according to the value of the room. Well, the same thing applies to a payment based on site value. You're paying for the benefit of that location, regardless of your income, regardless of your spending, regardless of your personal property.
Well, let me get in just a few minutes on that. The reason I mentioned the agricultural land reserve, I now fully realize not as value in agriculture, but the alternative value that it could have been had it been free. But I was just mentioning this as an example of cheating and chicanery, and the whole idea of appeal and assessors would lead to that. I don't see why it should be national and not worldwide. I don't see why a national barrier or a national boundary between, say, Canada and the U.S. or U.S. and Mexico, or Mexico and South America, or any other country. I don't see why it shouldn't be worldwide. I mean, if it's God-given, it's God-given, and the Pakistani baby and the Iowan baby are just as good as the West Virginia baby and the New York City baby. I'm not sure I understand that. But you're right about the moon. Initially, when they go to the moon, they wouldn't be taxed. But they know that if other people came to the moon, that they would be taxed. So surely this is less of an incentive under the land tax than if there were no land tax, or if the land tax was not. I didn't know about that, about the physiocrats. I'm glad to hear it, and I certainly wasn't accusing you of an ad hominem, saying that, you know, because Milton Friedman and Adam Smith favored the land tax, therefore the land tax is good. I'm just saying that those aren't really great guys. Now, with regard to the market failure, I can't see my way clear to agree. What you're in effect, you have to admit that right now we have X percent of land that's idle in Manhattan or in Chicago or in LA or San Francisco or any place like that. And you have to admit, I think, that if you had 100% tax, not on the value of the land, on the value determined by assessors, then there'd be a lot less idle land than right now. So what you're saying, assuming now we have a free enterprise system, so what you're in effect saying is that there is a market failure. Because we have too much idle land, and I don't see how you can get around that. But I haven't.
Sorry, you froze. Hello? Oh, it looks like he got kicked out for some reason. Hold on a sec. Hopefully he can come back in. Let me just give him a call. hold on. Here, let me pause his time also while I'm doing that. Hold on a sec. Hold on one sec. So, yeah. Okay, I paused your time, but can you come back on? Oh, here you are.
I think we'd have to end it. I'm sorry it took so long. Oh, we're back now. I don't know what happened. I'll hang up here. But I have this appointment at 4 o'clock, and I got to go now. And I apologize, Fred, because I screwed up. And I think I screwed up. I don't know. I'm not really technologically good. But I enjoyed this very much, and thanks for participating with me, and have a good day.
Thanks.
All right. See you guys later. Take care. All right. Thanks, everyone, for the debate.
Bye now.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Bye.